Hi everyone, just like to give a quick demo on how I use the free analysis software Kaleidoscope by Wildlife Acoustics to identify visually the calls of the large-eared pied bat, which is a threatened species in Australia. And I just use Kaleidoscope because it's free software. The first thing I do here is just get rid of this top bar because I don't need it, and then I like to zoom in on the area of interest, which kind of done automatically here for me. So I like to see between about 10 and 50 kilohertz because that's where most of the important information that we're going to need is. And then just to help me where the main bits of information, I'd like to add a guide bar about 21 kilohertz. So I just press right click there and about 24 kilohertz, and that just helps me really zero in on the area of focus. And that's because this species has an alternating call, like you can see here. Often it has a higher pulse up around 24 kilohertz and a lower pulse somewhere around 21 kilohertz. So the next thing you need to do is know the call of the species or what it looks like, and you also need to know how to drive the buttons on the software. So the main features that we use, I use these buttons here, which shows you the full call sequence. So this call is about 6 seconds, and you can see every pulse that was recorded. And then I use the toggle between compressed and uncompressed. So that's in real time, which is really important when you're looking for species with alternating calls. And this is where it's compressed. So all the spaces in between are compressed. And this is a large-eared pied bat call here. It's important to know the features of the species who you're trying to identify, and also any of the species that are likely to overlap or potentially be confused with it, which I'll talk about in a second. And then the other thing that's important to know is potential natural phenomena that could cause you confusion or mistakes. Features that I find really useful to identify these species. Firstly, the pulse shape is this hockey stick shape with a long frequency drop, often from the mid 40s down to the mid 20s for the higher pulses, and then from the mid 30s at least down to the low 20s for these lower pulses. And of course this species is really well known for having this pattern of what we call alternating pulses, where every second pulse is often higher than the pulse before it, but not always. Like you can see here, these two pulses are similar frequencies, and then there's a bunch over here that are similar. Although you need to bear in mind, if you look at these in the real time, the compressed view is handy, but when you're looking at calls with alternating pulses, you have to switch to real time and look. You can see that pulse seems to be missing between these two ones, which is a legitimate one, but some of these later ones, they're just a little bit quiet, so it hasn't been picked up so well in the compressed view. Another feature that I find really useful for identifying this bat is this what they call harmonics. So if you look at this pulse here, you can see there's these shadows of pulses up higher that are duplicates of them but at a higher frequency. And if you look at the details of them, so this pulse here is about 22 kilohertz, and then this one's pretty much double that at about 45 kilohertz. So that's really useful for differentiating it from the yellow-bellied sheath-tailed bat. It has different harmonic structure than the yellow-bellied sheath-tailed bat. The timing of pulses is another diagnostic feature. You have to zoom in, and what you can see, you could ignore this fluffy stuff here, that's an echo. If you press down on the mouse and pull across, you'll get a measure of the width of the call, and you can see here this pulse here is about 3.9 milliseconds, somewhere around 4 or 5, always usually less than 10 is pretty typical for this species. The time between the calls is also relatively diagnostic. So again, if you hold the mouse down and pull across, between the calls. You can see here that between these two pulses it's about 95 milliseconds there, and then across to this one it should be relatively evenly spaced. Again, yeah, about 96. Somewhere around 100 to 150 is really typical. Occasionally in calls you might see where this a quiet call, this middle one might be missing, or these high ones might be missing, and it might go up to about 200, but typically less than 200. And the other thing you'll notice is that the spacing of the pulses is consistent, and that's how you know it's an alternating bat and not multiple bats, is where those pulses should be all relatively consistently spaced. If you compare this call with the one before, this is not a large pied bat, but a bat that you could confuse with a large pied bat. You can see there's some pretty easy differences to differentiate it, and I'll go through them. This is the call from a yellow-bellied she-tailed bat, and the main way I can tell that that's not a large pied bat instantly is just by looking at this harmonic up here, which is low. It's at 28 kilohertz. So if you see a harmonic around 28-30 kilohertz and a pulse around 20 kilohertz, you know it can't be a large pied bat. Large pied bat, the lowest harmonic you would see would be around 40 kilohertz. And the reason why this harmonic is so much lower is because yellow-bellied she-tailed bats are an embalanurid, and they actually have a habit of calling loudest at their second harmonic. So there's a harmonic down here at about 10 kilohertz that we can't even see. Then it's got a louder one up here at about 20 kilohertz, which is the loudest one. Then there's another one up at 30, and then another one up at 40, and that pattern is really consistent for yellow-bellied she-tailed bats. The other thing with yellow-bellied she-tailed bat calls is if you zoom in them and look at the timing on them, they're often much longer. So this one you can see the pulse is about 11 milliseconds long, and the timing between the pulses is often much longer as well. So I have to zoom right out a bit, and then we can go and measure between these pulses here, and you'll see it's not, well, that one's about 390 milliseconds between the pulses, and you can really hear that when you play the sound. That's a long space. Here we go, look at these ones that are closer, but even there it's still 208 milliseconds, whereas the large pied bat's about 100. The other species that potentially overlaps or could be confused with the large pied bat in the area where I've got my recordings is this species, Ozimops planiceps. And one of the ways I can differentiate it, apart from the fact that it often calls slightly higher, but only just like 24 kilohertz, and sometimes it does call down at 22 kilohertz, is by this pulse shape. You can see it doesn't have that big frequency sweep on most pulses that the large pied bat had, and it also doesn't alternate. Occasionally you get these higher pulses like this one, especially when it's feeding or chasing food, but it doesn't have it on the typical pattern, and it also doesn't have the alternating. The timing of Ozimops planiceps calls are also a little bit different than the large pied bat. So if we do the same thing and zoom in and look on real time, the actual pulses are often longer. So that one's about 14.5 milliseconds, and you'll see that the time between the calls is also longer. So that's about 287 milliseconds. And if we go back this way to these fuzzy pulses, again it's about 200 milliseconds between the pulses, so almost twice as long as the large pied bat. Important thing to be aware of when you're looking at species with alternating calls is to toggle between this compressed and real-time view. You can see here these pulses look like they have some sort of a alternating pattern. They're higher than our target area, so I don't think they're pied bats. I think they're probably Gould's wattle bat or something else. But what I want to demonstrate is if you go into the real-time view here and you look, you can see that the spacing between the calls is really erratic. This one's short, then there's a bit of a longer gap, then there's two close together, then there's a longer gap, and then there's a couple in quick succession. And and they're all different volumes, and what that tells me is that there's multiple bats calling in this call. There they even have a little bit of a bicker. There's two loud ones close to each other. Almost certainly that's not the same bat. And so you've got to look at these calls, because sometimes these calls can look like they're alternating, but really it's just multiple bats. Thing to watch out for is the pulses of Ozimops planiceps in particular. Sometimes do get quite steep. You can see here there's a bunch of pulses. Some of them are dropping down from the mid-30s, and so you could be confused and think that these are similar to large-eared pipebat calls. Again, if you zoom in to real time, you can see they don't have as big a frequency sweep, and there's definitely not as much, or if any, pattern of alternation. But this is where, if you want to be certain, you can just measure, and you can see that that pulse is 14 milliseconds. So it's about 10 milliseconds longer than most dwyeri calls would be, and the space between these pulses is 190 milliseconds, which for a dwyeri that's a very long space. And so if you've got consistently really long spaces between pulses, there's no pattern of alternation, it's a bit higher in frequency than you'd expect, then that's an Ozimops planiceps call and not a large-eared pipebat call. So once I know what I'm looking for, and I've got my guard bars here, I can scroll quite quickly through the calls and just look for those features of something that I would want to look for. So this one could be a dwyeri, but I can see there's this harmonic up here, which is just 10 kilohertz higher than that one, so that's got to be a Saccolaimus. And I can scroll through and then say, well, that one I want to have a look at in more detail, or that one, it's out for whatever reason. So this one I definitely would go in and have a look at. It looks like it's got all of the characteristics. You'd measure it, it's about 4 milliseconds and across 98. So that one almost certainly is a large-eared pipebat, and that's basically how I do it.